Mr. Chomsky, we're talking there about American terror, and I think you make a very accurate observation that we are responsible for what we do, but hardly responsible for what other people do, except insofar as we are in a position to influence them.
That's right.
For instance, if there is a mass starvation in Biafra, even though we did not cause it, there is a sense in which we are responsible if we don't do something to attempt to alleviate it.
Right.
Now, by the same token, if we are prepared to agree that it is not always easy to taxonomize military action into that which is terroristic and that which is purely a military operation, we are left with doubts, for instance, about the bombing of Germany in 1942, 43, 44. Mm-hmm. You might contend that this was terroristic and unnecessary, and you might be right, although you're not a military expert, neither am I. But I think
there's a point to that.
Yeah, but I do judge that even if we all agreed that what we did in Dresden was inexcusable, as a moral question, it's got to be understood in context of what was it that brought us to Dresden in the first instance.
Absolutely.
And what brought us to South Vietnam in the first instance, in my judgment, was clearly an uninterested, or I should say disinterested, concern for the stability and possibilities of a region of the world. What
period do you feel that we had this disinterested relationship to Vietnam?
Right now.
No, at what period did we have it? Did it begin? Let's say 1951, for example, when the State Department bulletin points out that we must help the French reconquer their former colony, and we must eradicate all Vietnamese resistance down to its last roots in order to reestablish the French in power. Was that disinterested?
To increase my vulnerability, I wish we had helped the French.
We did. We supported them.
Not sufficiently.
Well, but
there's no point in helping somebody insufficiently.
It was hardly disinterested when we attempted, as you know, with tremendous support, in fact, to reinstate French imperialism in South Vietnam.
Now, it was disinterested in this sense, and I think this is an important distinction which you do touch on in your book. It's a disinterested act if my attempt to help, or your attempt to help a particular nation, is in order to spare you the possibility of a great ordeal in the future, which will harm you, your family, your children, your republic.
And in that sense, Nazi Germany was also disinterested.
Yeah,
after all, Nazi Germany was conquering Eastern Europe only in order to advance the values of Christian spiritual civilization and to restore the Slavs to their rightful home and so on and so forth. Totally disinterested.
Look, I follow you. But if you want me to pursue that digression, I will.
Okay.
But let's suspend it for a moment. Okay. I'm distinguishing that kind of disinterestedness between the kind of...
But that's not a kind of disinterestedness. You see, that's something which includes as a special case every case of military aggression and colonialism in history. It's all disinterested in your sense.
Well, all right, let me simply rest my case by saying that there is an observable distinction by intelligent men between a country that reaches out and interferes with the affairs of another country because it has reason to believe that a failure to do so will result in universal misery, and that country which reaches out and interferes with another country because it wants to establish Coca-Cola plants there and chase national banks and whatever and exploit it. Now, that is an observable
It's a conceptual well, let's distinguish between a conceptual distinction and a factual
I'm prepared to do
distinction.
that.
All right, it is a conceptual distinction, but in actual fact, the history of colonialism shows that these two motivations can coincide. That is, practically every... I mean, there are exceptions. You know, probably the Belgians and the Congo are an exception. But by and large, the major imperialist ventures have been in the economic, in the material interest, or in the perceived material
I'm
interest.
not interested in the mathematics of the...
Let me finish.
You have already conceded that it's not merely a conceptual difference.
I say it is.
There are exceptions.
There are a few exceptions.
All right.
Like say
okay. All right, let's talk about the exceptions then.
Well, no, but the exceptions are at the difference. No, wait a minute. The exceptions, I mentioned, for example, the Belgians and the Congo. There, they didn't even pretend to have a civilizing mission. There, it was pure material self-interest. These are the exceptions. There are, as far as I know, no exceptions on the other side. There are. I mean, maybe I've left out a case of history, but as I see the history of colonialism, the great mass of cases are cases where a powerful country was working in its perceived material self-interest and was covering what it was doing to itself and to the world with very pleasant phrases about preserving Christian values or helping the poor benighted natives or one thing or another. Now, there are a few exceptions where there was pure predatory imperialism. not even any pretense of doing anything, but these are quite rare.
But not
and
all
we're
that,
in the mainstream
not
of imperialism.
The
Predatory imperialism?
Sure, the history of the Roman Empire.
Well, let's take since the Industrial Revolution.
Since the Industrial Revolution. Well, if you say that people have refined the art of apologetics, I don't deny it. But it is also true, and I think manifestly true, that there have been interferences with the affairs of other nations whose purposes were, in my judgment, manifestly benign.
For example?
Well, for instance, the Truman Doctrine.
Oh, I don't think that was manifestly benign at all. That was an attempt to
the Greeks
develop an
benign. I think the
Greek situation was benign, not at all. We were
I say the Greeks' testimony is more interesting to me than yours.
Which Greek testimony?
The testimony
of the thousands of people who were thrown into jail and...
I grant not the testimony of the Greek communists who were beaten.
Or the Greek peasants who were...
There again, is it a conceptual difference that between the person who desires a life under some kind of freedom and one who desires life under some kind of... under communism?
No, because there's no such opposition in Greece. There was a distinction between a very repressive regime, which we instituted in 1946, and another regime, I don't know what it would have been, that would have grown out of a victory of the so-called communists. Now, if you see, what we did had nothing to do with freedom. What we instituted was
This is absolute historical romancing, I would say,
I don't believe
because the number of people who were slaughtered in Greece, first by the communist insurgency, then by the Nazis, then again by the communists, add up to an enormous
communist insurgency before the Nazis? Which one?
Not insurgency, conquest.
Communist conquest before the Nazis in Greece?
Communist insurgency.
Prior to the Nazis in Greece?
Yes, the Civil War of the early 40s.
My point is that
the Greeks...
your history is quite confused. There was no communist insurgency prior to the Nazis. There were communist resistance bands that fought against the Nazis.
This is a matter of nomenclature. The point is that the 40-year-old or the 45-year-old Greek has fought 3 times in certain ventures, in one of which they acknowledge that we bailed them out.
Who is they? Who is they? The rulers of Greece acknowledge that.
No, also the people.
Oh, I'm quite unaware of that. I'm quite unaware that the people of Greece have spoken on this issue.
Even Papandreou, you like him, I assume, because he hates us.
No, not at all. Not at all. George Papandreou was one of the people who was...
I'm talking about Andrea, which makes it even...
Is Andreas Papandreou?
Both on record as being grateful to President Truman for his intervention in that part of the world in 1947.
In that case, I disagree with him on that issue. I really do. I think we had no right to intervene in Greece in 1947.
Now we're talking about rights,
and which
gets us away from the discussion.
All right, let's talk about whether we did it
whether or not there is such a thing as relatively disinterested international interference. And it seems to me that America's record is rather good. We went through an imperialist phase, but we pulled out of it faster than any country in the history of civilization.
I think we're very deep.
Why did we pull out of the Philippines, for instance?
We pulled out of the Philippines because it became a bad investment.
Why?
Because if you look, American agricultural interests were very much opposed to the, back in the mid-30s, they were very strongly opposed to the free trade relationships which allowed Philippine crops to compete with them. That's why we pulled out of the Philippines.
Why do these agricultural interests authorize us to intervene in South Vietnam?
They didn't.
If you consider this is...
Because we didn't intervene on
the critical dimension.
No, I say that in the Philippines it was the critical dimension. Look, the world is a complex place.
I'm aware of
There are certain interests that were involved...
MIT is a complex place.
Well, there were certain interests that were involved in our Philippine venture. There are different interests that are involved in our Vietnam venture. You see, our Vietnam... Don't forget that with the Second World War, America's imperial interests expanded enormously. I mean, prior to the Second World War, we were sort of a marginal imperialist power, except for the Monroe Doctrine. But since the Second World War, we became the world's major imperialist power. And Vietnam is simply one piece of an attempt to construct a very large integrated world system, of which Greece was another piece.
Yeah, we became an imperial power, Mr. Chomsky, in the sense that we inherited primary responsibility for any chain of action that might involve us in a Third World War.
I don't believe
and something that might involve the entire world in Holocaust. And
no,
under the circumstances... well, I know you don't believe it, but
in fact, I think that
it might be refreshing to listen to this point of view, which is that there are people who do believe that America, unhappily and certainly not desiring it, inherited the responsibility for trying to abort international Holocaust, and has from time to time done so by such ventures as the Truman Doctrine, martial aid, and things like that.
No, I don't agree with
martial aid not this.
No, martial aid is quite different. First of all, martial...
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I interrupted you, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you've now mentioned Marshall Aid for the first time, and Marshall Plan aid has to be distinguished quite sharply from the Truman Doctrine.
Why?
Why? Because the Truman Doctrine was a doctrine of military intervention, and the Marshall Plan was our first attempt at a major aid program.
You do understand that sometimes a soldier can be as useful as a bushel of wheat, don't you?
Now look, nevertheless, if we're going to be at all clear about the American role, we're certainly going to distinguish between military intervention and economic intervention. They're very different in the way they function. Now, the fact of the matter is that neither was disinterested in your sense, I don't think, but they're very different in the impact that they had. The Truman Doctrine, I think, was a disastrous venture. I think the Marshall Plan was arguable. I mean, one understood what
how do you
for,
explain the schizophrenia?
I don't agree with it.
How do you explain the schizophrenia of a public which willed both more or less simultaneously? On the one hand, you say that the public is incapable of acting disinterestedly.
The public didn't will either.
Well, the government.
Because both were.
But the government backed by the public has that. How do you explain that the same government on Monday did the Truman Doctrine, which you consider simply sort of be a projection of the evil impulses of the government, and on Tuesday did something which you consider to be very good? What happened to the government between Monday and Tuesday?
First of all, I didn't say I considered it to be very good. I said it's rather different, and one has to bring different standards to bear in evaluating it.
Why is it different? Let me give you an example. Suppose you're a farmer.
Because there's a difference between receiving...
And you need agriculture. You need fertilizer. So you apply to me for fertilizer. But just before I get it to you, somebody comes up with a bayonet and is about to make it impossible for you to continue farming. Now, in that particular instance, is there a strategic difference between my giving you the fertilizer and my giving the soldier who routs?
That's not. So you're talking about a dream world. The real world is one, because the real world is one in which the alternatives were coming with a bayonet, which is on an American rifle held by an American-backed Greek soldier, and the alternative to that was giving the kind of aid which was used, in fact, to construct the kind of society in Western Europe that we wanted to see developed there. Now, these are two very different things. It's a very different thing to introduce, to run for the Greek army a counterinsurgency program with military support and many military men involved. That's one kind of thing, one sort of repression imposed on the Greek population through American intervention. One might argue whether it's right or wrong, but that's to be very sharply distinguished.
Why do you say imposed? Why do you say imposed? Is it because your presumption here...
My presumption is that
your presumption here is that the Greeks would like the kind of regime which resulted...
My assumption is that all intervention is imposed by any country. That is, you see, I believe that quite generally...
Did we impose on the French when we liberated them from the Nazis? Was that an imposition?
We didn't conquer France. We moved the Germans out of just from an outside invading force.
We invaded
But we
France.
didn't conquer it from its own people. See, in Greece we were trying to conquer it from its own people.
But there you're willing to credit the anti-Nazis as their own people, but you're not in Greece willing to credit the anti-communists as their own people.
The German army was there. There was no outside army in Greece other than ours.
Look, there are modalities of outside intervention.
But look, there's a very sharp difference between... Just a minute, there's a very sharp difference
Laval was not a Nazi.
But Laval wouldn't have lasted for 5 minutes without the German army.
And nor would Makarios have lasted for 5 minutes without the help of Russian aid.
But wait a minute.
In fact, as you know, when Stalin got tired of Makarios, he pulled out.
But look, now let's be careful again. I mean, there's a difference between... First of all, I'm opposed to military aid to other countries, whether by us or by the Soviet Union. Well, let's come back to that because it's a more important thing. And that is that I'm even far more opposed to the imposition of regimes by foreign troops. Now, in the case of Germany, let's say, in the case of France, the Pétain-Laval government, the Vichy government, was supported by German troops. Had the German... they weren't throughout the country necessarily, because there was certainly indigenous support, but there's no question that if German military force had been withdrawn to the other side of the Rhine, then there would have been an overthrow of the Vichy government, and France would have had some different form of government. Now, in that case, our invasion of France was, whether one likes it or not, was in reaction to an occupying external force. It's just pure confusion to identify that with the case of Greece, when we were trying to liberate, we were trying to select the kind of society that Greece would have, and we were trying to save the rulers that we had designated as appropriate from their own population. There were no outside forces.
But don't you realize that in your book, and that's why you're not willing to be consistent in carrying out this argument, you're constantly talking about our satellizing of places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic and so on and so forth, and yet we never occupied them in the sense in which you're talking about.
Well, we never occupied the Dominican Republic. We sent 25,000 troops there in 1965 in an occupation.
No, I'm talking about I'm talking
well,
about
the American Marines were in there dozens of times since 1900.
I think you're being evasive, and I don't think you want to be.
No,
Let me ask you this. Is it possible?
It's not evasive at all.
I mean,
you know, we just simply repeatedly sent troops to Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, etc., etc.
Is it possible to satellize a nation without having an occupying army there?
Yes, it is.
All right, then there goes your French, your tedious French explanation.
Oh, not at all, because that doesn't happen to be, you see, we're talking about a real situation.
Yeah.
We could talk about some ideal situation and, you know, have an academic discussion about it.
I'm saying, therefore, it is possible for North Vietnam to satellize South Vietnam, presumably, without even
it's logically
occupying it militarily in a formal sense.
But it didn't happen, though. So
well, this is an argument considering which there are 2 points of view.
Well, let's discuss it then.
Historically.
Yeah, in fact, you see, there's much more, if you want to be serious about it, there's more evidence that South Vietnam tried to colonize North Vietnam than conversely. In fact, South Vietnamese commandos were going, military forces, regular military forces, were going north considerably earlier than the time when we even proclaimed that the infiltration began from north to south.
Did they bump into the refugees coming south?
The refugees were coming south, were going in both directions, in fact, in 1954-55, and at least according to Bernard Fall, the commandos began going north in 56 or 57. The first claimed infiltration from the north was in 59, and that was South Vietnamese coming south. So if one wants to talk about, again, the real world, the first motion
the trouble is, your difficulty with Chomsky is, in my judgment, you never know where neatly to begin your historical
you choose the point of beginning.
Well, the point really is that if you're starting to say that 1959 was a provocation because there was...
No, it wasn't a provocation.
I say, well, but how about the people who were going from north to south who were talking about the misery that had been brought about Ho Chi Minh and so forth?
When was that?
I mean...
Well, which people are you talking about? I don't know.
Well, I'm talking about Vietnamese, north and south. Your trouble, I think, is neatly captured in the remark made recently by Czechoslovakia, that Czechoslovakia is, after all, the most neutralist country in the world, since it declines to interfere even with its own internal affairs.
I don't see the relevance.
Well, the relevance is very simply that you start your line of discussion at a moment that is historically useful for you.
That's what I say. You pick the beginning.
Of the post-war world is that the communist imperialists, by the use of terrorism, by deprivation of freedom, have contributed to the continuing bloodshed, and the sad thing about it is not only the bloodshed, but the fact that they seem to dispossess you of the power of rational observation.
May I say something?
Sure.
Yeah. I think that's about 5% true, and or maybe 10% true. It certainly is true.
Why do you give that?
May I complete a sentence?
Sure.
I mean, it's perfectly true that there were areas of the world, in particular Eastern Europe, where Stalinist imperialism very brutally took control and still maintains control. But there are also very vast areas of the world where we were doing the same thing. And there's quite an interplay in the Cold War. You see, what you just described is I believe, a mythology about the Cold War, which might have been tenable 10 years ago, but which is quite inconsistent with contemporary scholarship.
Ask a Czech.
Ask a Guatemalan, ask a Dominican, ask a person from the Dominican Republic, ask a person from South Vietnam, ask a Thai.
Obviously, we can't get away. If you can't distinguish between the nature of our venture in Guatemala and the nature of the Soviet Union's in Prague, then we have real difficulty.
Explain the difference.
Sorry.